G'day everyone and welcome to video 4.2.3 for the Legal Studies guy. Our quote today from Robert Kiyosaki: "Don't let the fear of losing be greater than the excitement of winning," aka put everything you've got out there to try and win, because that's what you're going for. Don't be happy with second best. Don't let the fear of losing or the fear of what if I put myself out there and don't go as well as I think I will be the reason why you don't actually then do it. 4.2.3 is the reasons for and effects of statutory interpretation. Again, we're building up to this skill of being able to discuss the factors that affect the ability of courts to make law. So this is another way which courts make law, through statutory interpretation. So our essential question is, what is statutory interpretation and why do we need it? So effectively, and this was included in the last slide as well about the court's ability to make law, statutory interpretation is the process undertaken by judges to apply, it's a really, really key word, the words of an act of Parliament to specific fact situations. So as we know, Parliament writes the laws. They write them quite broad generally to try and cover a broad range of situations, and then the courts have to actually then apply it to a really specific situation. This is what occurred. Absolutely, this isn't a true example, but this is just a really, really basic way to try and understand it. Parliament might write a law like a food safety law that says, you can't serve meat that's contaminated at a restaurant. The law would obviously not be that broad, and there would be parameters around it. But say it's that broad, you can't serve meat that's contaminated. Then people at a restaurant get sick, and it's because meat was thawed out on a bench overnight before being cooked. Then the judge would have to sit there and determine, because maybe the restaurant's saying, well, no, that's normal practice. That meat wasn't contaminated. People might have got sick for another reason. So the judge then has to actually determine, okay, the restaurant's not allowed to serve contaminated meat. Does what happened in this case, leaving it out on the bench overnight, does that make it contaminated? So the judge actually has to then take the words and apply them to the situation at hand. So why do we have to do that? Well, that first reason is just what I've talked about, broad and general terms. Most legislation is drafted to cover a spread of situations and then needs to be applied to a specific situation. An example here is Diang v. Tiroler, otherwise known as the studded belt case. This is a quite famous case in legal studies. It is where there was an act of Parliament, a statute that said you could not carry a regulated weapon, or it was an offence, a criminal offence to carry a regulated weapon, but didn't have a clear definition of what this was. The police arrested this guy for wearing a studded belt, and they said that the studded belt was a weapon, because obviously it can be used as a weapon. And statutory interpretation there was the judge had to look at this specific situation, guys wearing a studded belt, and apply the legislation to it, which said you can't carry a regulated weapon. So effectively had to interpret what regulated weapon meant. In this case, the interpretation was that a regulated weapon was anything whose primary purpose was that of a weapon. So a studded belt, its primary purpose is to hold your pants up, therefore not a weapon. So that's statutory interpretation at play. You might need to interpret a statute to take into account future circumstances. So the Act might need to be clarified as new situations arise. A great example of this is external affairs. The Commonwealth Constitution needed to be clarified as more and more treaties were signed, and treaties started being signed in areas of residual power. So the High Court, in this case, had to interpret what external affairs meant and whether that meant the Commonwealth could make laws in those residual areas. Ambiguous wording. So a little bit different to broad and general terms. This is the idea that some words or phrases might have multiple meanings. So it might mean multiple things, or it could mean multiple things. an example of this is Davies v. Waldron. This is a case, and you can look this one up and find stuff online. I think the wording in the act was, it was a road safety act. It was about being in charge of a motor vehicle if you are over the legal limit, so over 0.05. And the dispute was around what being in charge of a motor vehicle meant. The police intercepted or picked up this guy. He was in a parked car, but the car's motor was on, and he blew 0.1 or something like that. He was arrested and charged with being in charge of a motor vehicle when his blood alcohol content was over 0.05. He argued that there was never any intention to drive. I think the argument was that he was trying to jumpstart the car for his friend or something similar. And because he never actually intended to drive or put it into gear, then he wasn't actually in charge of the motor vehicle, if that makes sense. So the debate was around what actually being in charge of a motor vehicle means. Do you have to have an intention to drive, so on and so forth. Pretty sure he was convicted and said if you turn the ignition on and you are over the limit, then you are in charge of that motor vehicle and you can be charged. Finally, there's the changing nature of words, and this just means the idea that we can write an act and then the actual meaning of the word itself in the act can change as society changes. Really, really great example here is the Kevin and Jennifer case, and this was a case around the Marriage Act, when the Marriage Act originally said marriage must be between a man and a woman, to the exclusion of all others. What happened in this case was, though, that Kevin was born a woman, but had gone through the process of actually had an operation to become a man. So Kevin was what we call post-operative, meaning they'd had an operation, post-operative transsexual male. So Kevin and Jennifer wanted to get married. Jennifer was a biological woman. Kevin was a man for all intents and purposes in society. So they tried to get married, and it was actually the Commonwealth Attorney General, so the Commonwealth government, who challenged this and said he is not a man, and the federal court had to interpret what the word man meant now that society had changed, and there was such a thing as well, there's obviously always been transsexual males, but such a thing as the ability to undergo hormone replacement therapy and have an operation, etc., etc. In this ruling, the interpretation was that a post-operative transsexual male, so someone who's had an operation and is legally recognised as a male in society for everything else, is therefore a man in the Marriage Act as well. So now the Marriage Act is marriage between two people, but when the Marriage Act said marriage must be between a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others, man included both those born as males and those who were born as female but had undergone gender reassignment surgery. So that's the reasons for statutory interpretation. What are the effects of it? So what happens after the statute is interpreted? Well, really, really simply, in the studded belt case, that wording of regulated weapon, that now became the definition of regulated weapon in that act. It's not written in there, but the statute can now be applied to specific fact situations. So it gives specific meaning to those words in the statute and is read together with the statute in the future. This therefore develops precedent as well. So this is a second effect of it. In future cases, the legislation and the interpretation are read together to form the complete law. Okay, so it develops a precedent for future cases. The statute needs to be interpreted in the same way in future cases in lower courts, because they are bound by this, and courts on the same level or higher will be persuaded to come to the same definition. One effect of statutory interpretation, we look at this in the next set of slides, in 4.2.5, around the relationship between Parliament and the courts, is that Parliament can actually choose to amend the legislation and overrule the court's interpretation. So in the studded belt case, for example, the courts decided a regulated weapon is something whose primary purpose is to be a weapon. If Parliament decided, no, anything being used as a weapon in that situation or in that time is a regulated weapon, they could have actually redone the law to say this and put this definition in and overrule what the courts had said. So Parliament has the power to amend legislation to overrule the courts because they are the supreme lawmaking power, and we call this abrogation. Finally, Parliament can do the opposite of abrogation, and they can codify. This is where they choose to amend the legislation and confirm the court's interpretation. So they actually just write it into the Act, into stone, so that no future courts can actually change that precedent, because obviously, again, Parliament is the supreme lawmaking body. So they can confirm the court's interpretation, and codify it. What's our skill? Again, we are building up to our ability to discuss the factors that affect the ability of courts to make laws, which will be the next set of slides. But we can also potentially expect questions as simple as this: outline one effect of the interpretation of the statute by judges. So this was question 1A from 2012, I think. So this has been in a past legal studies exam. Just outline one effect of the interpretation of statutes. And this is what the examiners said. You can see most people, well, half the people got 2 marks. Words or phrases in the statute are given meaning, what we said. A precedent is set for future cases, or might be extended, or, might be broadened, and the law potentially could be restricted. So that's another effect that I didn't quite go over. When words are given more meaning, this can actually broaden the interpretation of the statute, like external affairs. When external affairs was given more meaning to cover any treaty, this actually gave it a really, really broad meaning, whereas in the studded belt, saying a regulated weapon is only something whose primary purpose is to be a weapon gives it a really narrow interpretation. So that's the effect of it. The specific meaning given to the word can actually broaden or narrow the piece of law. The question was generally handled well. Good little bit of info here. An outline requires more than stating or identifying something, but less than a full description or explanation. So just remember that if you see outline in the future. It required no more than 2 or 3 sentences, nice and simple. And an example was a good way to provide a fuller outline. So things like the studded belt case, external affairs, Davies v. Waldron, Kevin and Jennifer, great examples to know just to bulk up your answer. Here's a really good point though. Students are expected to know the difference between the reasons for statutory interpretation and the effects of. Some students provided a reason rather than an effect and therefore did not gain any marks. So important to always remember that language from the study design of the difference between a reason for and an effect of statutory interpretation. I've given you a couple of links. A newspaper article on the Kevin and Jennifer case from 2003 about the decision being handed down. So that's a good one to look at, old-fashioned. And then one of those Engage Wiki pages that gives a description of the studded belt case for you to read through. It's a good one to look at because there were some appeals and different courts involved. Hopefully at the end of that, you can tell us what statutory interpretation is and why we need it. Happy studying. Make sure you like and subscribe. Peace out from the legal.